Yeah, Hilal, I think you can start.
Yeah, shall we start
Yes,
or shall we wait for others to join?
Mm,
I think we can begin,
but-
and Dr. Sharan
Yeah.
will join.
Uh, yeah. Let me call Ayodhya because the network is a problem here.
ज्वाइन कर ज्वाइन कर लिए ओके 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 No, Dr. Sharan wants half a minute because we have multiple events taking place today in CSDS. So there is another Rajiv Bhargav's conference taking place downstairs. So just half a minute. है मेरे पास चाहिए रहने दो नहीं चाहिए
Welcome, everybody, to this book launch and panel discussion on politics and society between elections. We are very happy that you are able to be here and listen to these conversations on what we believe are some very important and critical issues that is unfolding in India's politics and society today. So we have with us a group of panelists. Professor Hilal Ahmed from CSDS will begin with the introductions of the panelists, and I hand it over to Dr. Hilal Ahmed. Thank you, Hilal, for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's actually a great pleasure for me to introduce all of you. It's very difficult to say good morning, good evening, because in the time of internet, it is very difficult to make sense of where we are. So I welcome on behalf of Center for the Study of Developing Societies and Lokniti program. This is an important event because we are going to launch a much awaited book, which is, the data of the book has already been there in the public domain with our three reports. But the compilation of data in a form of a book is something that has just come out. And it's a remarkable job. We looked at the book. It was a remarkable job by Siddharth and Suhas Pai. So, what we are going to do today is basically to have a formal release of the book, and at the same time, we have a panel discussion on the book. So, let me just first introduce you the program. The program is like as follows. Uh, uh, Professor Avdhendra Sharan, who is the director of Center for the Studies of Developing Society, he will welcome all the participants. Then I will invite Professor Sanjay Kumar to make a few remarks on this study. Then I would invite Professor Suhas Palshikar to tell us more what is inside the book, and Professor Siddharth Swaminathan, because both of them work together on that. And then there would be a discussion on the book. So first, Professor Surinder Jodhka, and followed by Professor Sudha Pai. Uh, I think it is important for all of us to introduce our panelists at the moment. Uh, Professor Suhas Palshikar taught political science in Pune University, and at the moment he has extensively, and I know need not to uh, read his entire CV to introduce him. He is editor. He's the co-director of Center for the. He's the co-director of Lokniti, and he's the editor of Studies in Indian Politics. Uh, Siddharth Swaminathan is a professor at Azim Premji University and extensively written on the question of Indian politics and society on different issues. And at the moment, he was, in fact, the part of the study which we did with Azim Premji University. Professor Sudha Pai, we all know her as a great teacher, retired as a professor at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has written extensively on Indian political life, and one of my favorite books by her is on everyday communalism that came out a few years ago. We also have Professor Surinder Jodhka, who is a professor of sociology and chair at the Center for the Study of Social System at the School of Social Sciences with Jawaharlal University, New Delhi. Professor Jodhka has written extensively on the question of politics and its relationship with society, especially the idea of village as well as the idea of sorry about the internet. So, Professor Jodhka has written extensively. Uh, we have with us my colleague, Professor Sanjay Kumar, who is the co-director of Lokniti and has been working on the issues of election and Indian politics for over 2 decades. And we have Professor Charan, whose recent book, he is a historian by training, but his recent book, Smoke, is something which forces us to look at the relationship between politics and society from a very different vantage point. So without any delay, I would like to begin the program by inviting Professor Avadendra Sharan to welcome the participant. Over to you, Professor Sharan. I think there is some problem with the internet, as Sanjay ji told you, that there are various programs going on at the center. So, Professor Sharan is going to join us in a while.
Thank you, Hilal. It's my pleasure on behalf of CSDS to welcome all of you to this afternoon's function. Uh, as Hilal mentioned, we are gathered here to celebrate and discuss this wonderful book on politics and society between elections. I'm especially grateful to Professor Sudha Pai and Professor Surinder Jodhka, who have joined us as panelists for this afternoon's program. Uh, Several of us uh, have been participating in the discussions around the interim presentations of these reports, which was the project done between CSDS, Lokniti, and Azim Premji University. And it's a pleasure that the book is finally out and is available to us to discuss. So my congratulations to the entire Lokniti team, and especially to the editors, Professor Suhas Palshikar and Siddharth Swaminathan. With that, let me hand over to Hilal again. Thank you.
I apologize for these technical problems. We are in the process of solving them. But I think now I would like to invite Professor Sanjay Kumar to make an introductory remark.
Thank you, Hilal. I would like to join our director, CSDS, Professor Avdendra Sharan, in welcoming you again for this event. Special welcome to Professor Surinder Jodhka and Professor Sudha Pai, who have kindly agreed to discuss the book. And again, congratulations from my side to Professor Siddharth Swaminathan and Professor Suhas Palshikar for their new book. Uh, the book, Politics and Society Between Elections, Public Opinion in India's States, is the product of a research collaboration between Azim Premji University and Lokniti. The aim of this collective research was to read people's mind when there are no elections. As Lokniti as a team has been doing various studies during elections, reading people's mind about various issues, voting behavior. But we decided that we should also try and understand people's mind when there is no elections. So this collaborative project helped us in understanding people's opinions, attitudes, anxieties, and related issues when there are no elections in the state. So basically, in this 3-year collaborative project, what we did was to do a survey in large number of states, and we asked questions around the following themes. So these were the themes which were the focus of this project. Questions of identity and consciousness, question of discrimination and violence, delivery of public services, and we asked question about public health systems, schools, and other related issues, citizens' perception about state institutions and their trust in citizens' trust in state institutions. There were also questions about issues related to majoritarian nationalism and populism. So basically, these were the 5 or 6 kinds of theme which this project tried to focus upon. Uh, when you look at the book, you would figure out that some of the chapters in the book directly focuses on these themes. As I mentioned earlier, also this was a collaborative project between of Lokniti CSDS and Azim Premji University, and this was a 3-year project. We started the project in 2016-17, and the project went on say till 2019-20. The study was conducted in almost 24 states of India. The 3 years were meant for 3 different rounds of study. So in round one, we conducted the survey. We collected the data in 4 states. In round two, we collected the data in 8 states, and in the last year of the study, we collected the data in 16 states, 12 states. So the idea behind doing the study in 3 rounds was precisely because we wanted to collect the data when there were the states were in the middle of the election cycle. We didn't want to collect the data at the time when there was an election mood in the state. So that is why this systematic plan of collecting data from the state which was in the middle of an election cycle. So in all together, we covered 24 states. As per the research design, there were 2,000 interviews done in each state, and all these respondents were selected randomly. So, altogether in 24 states, we managed to do 48,542 interviews. So, it's a very large sample based on which the analysis is presented in various chapters of the book. Since we wanted to do a comparison, so almost the questionnaire, the same set of questions were asked in all the 3 rounds, except that there were some changes which were required from round 1 to round 2 to round 3. So this is how the whole project was unfolded in 3 years. After every round of study, we published a report which was not for sale, but for private circulations. We tried to analyze the data after every round, but this book is an output of the entire data which has been collected based on all the 3 rounds. So I will leave it here and request Maybe it is Suhas Palshikar, Siddharth, Swaminathan, who have worked on the book to share more details about what is the findings, what are the interesting findings in this book. Thank you, Hilal.
Thank you very much, Sanjay Bhai, for these initial remarks. I would now like to invite Professor Suhas Palshikar to make an elaborated note on this particular book that is a compilation of the three studies which Sanjay Bhai mentioned. Over to you, Suhas Bhai.
Sorry to interrupt, Hilal, but Suhas ji and I had a discussion, and I will be making the presentation on the book, and Suhas ji will be giving the final thoughts and a vote of thanks. So with that, let me begin. I'd like to share a small presentation, a PPT, and um, and begin a discussion of the book. So I will.
Yeah, please go ahead, Siddharth.
Yes, I am trying to share the screen. Yes, there we go. Um, yes, thank you. Okay. So, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here. Let me begin with a description of what this report, this book, and more broadly, what the project is all about, and focus on three key dimensions: the analytic, the empirical, and the substantive. As Sanjay ji noted earlier, this report summarizes and describes patterns in public opinion that we obtained through a large sample survey of respondents across 23 states, Indian states, and the National Capital Region. The survey was carried out between 2017 and 2019. So, to begin with, first, our analytic focus is on the period between elections. We ask why the period between elections. At one level, despite the observable difference between the period during elections and the period between elections, clearly the analytic separation between the two is much more difficult to delineate. This is because any analytic line that we draw between these two periods is indeed very porous. We do know that one has an impact, a substantial impact on the other. Yet we find this distinction to be a useful one, primarily because the period between elections is when opinions about identities, institutions, public policy, and governance are shaped. New policies are introduced, governance is routinized, institutions tend to be reshaped, and so on. Elections, on the other hand, are episodic and reflect periods of heightened and intense mobilization, unlike periods between elections. Most importantly, though, the period between elections allows us to focus on individuals as citizens rather than as voters. We rely on these key differences while thinking about public opinion in the period between elections as deserving an examination on its own, and as being distinct from vote choice and voter choices. And while we do know a lot about what drives vote choices during elections through many election studies, we know much less about public opinion between elections and how such opinions are formed. Second, I look at the empirical element. This study aims at a systematic subnational comparison of political and social attitudes. National aggregation, while important and useful, tends to mask an extraordinary diversity in attitudes at a subnational or a state level. The large sample size of this survey points to the possibility of arriving at generalizations across space, either regionally and or subnationally. or even compare a subset of states within a particular region or states across regions within India. While such comparisons are commonplace in some social sciences such as economics, it is relatively rare in political science, sociology, and public policy, which tend to adopt largely case study approaches or provide ethnographic accounts. Our aim, therefore, is to encourage research that utilizes a large number of observations in order to empirically test theoretically relevant, theoretically derived hypotheses about public opinion in India. Who holds what sorts of opinions, and how are these opinions distributed across states in India? And what likely explains this variation? These are the sorts of questions that we explore in this book, in this project, and in these reports, and hope to continue to do so in future analysis. Third, substantively, the study examines public opinion across a wide range of substantive issues, including social ties, political identities, access to basic services, governance, and institutions. More specifically, on social identities, the survey asks respondents about their friendship ties with members from other communities, their perceptions of other communities, opinions about gender roles and responsibilities, and preferences over leader identities. Regarding political identities, the survey focuses on citizens' opinions on elements of nationalism, regionalism, as well as subnationalism, freedom of expression, and populism. On the issue of, or on the theme of political institutions, governance, and public policy, the survey focuses on citizen-state interfaces, citizen trust in institutions, their views on procedural and distributive justice, access to political leaders, land governance, efficacy and ease of accessing services such as water, health, education, power, and so on. So largely these three dimensions define the contours of this study. Next, what I would like to do is briefly summarize some of the key findings from this project. I'd like to note at this point that a chapter is also available as a free download in the Routledge webpage. If you do a search for politics and society between elections on this webpage, and you're taken to that page, you will find an open access chapter. Please, you can download that and take a look at it. And hopefully copies of this book will soon be available in libraries. That said, let me quickly give you an overview of some of the key findings in this book. Of course, I'd like to point out that the study itself, as I noted, covers a number of substantive issues, and I will not be getting into much detail into each of these topics, but I certainly request you to take a look at it wherever it is available. So I will just provide a very broad overview of some of the key findings in this book that we summarize. First, we find that social lives remain homogeneous and exclusive. We observe stronger bonding capital, intra-caste and inter-community, in intra-caste and intra-community, and much less bridging capital across caste and community identities when we examine friendship ties, especially across caste and community identities. We also observe a persistence of caste and community stereotypes drawn along the axes of hardworking or lazy, violent or peaceful, patriotic or unpatriotic. There is also a strong preference for leaders from one's own community. And more interestingly, what we observe is a paradoxical mix of opinion a mix that combines the authoritarian with the democratic, traditional with the modern, and exclusive with inclusive opinions, especially when it comes to social attitudes. Distinct spatial patterns. We find distinct spatial patterns in the distribution of political identity, be it a regional identity or a subnational identity or a cultural national one. We find that a cultural majoritarianism sits very uneasy with persistent subnational identities. And indeed, this seems to be one of those other paradoxical strains that we point to. There are clear regional patterns in how citizens perceive their own political identities. And finally, we also find that while populism is evident at the level of elite discourse, public opinion does not take a populist bent, as against much of what has been said and written about populism in India. We also find that there appears to be a more or less even spatial distribution of governance outcomes when it comes to awareness of schemes and access to schemes. There are some variations spatially, but more or less we find that citizens are aware of state as well as central schemes and are able to access many of these schemes. However, minority caste communities are much less aware and have a much more difficult time in accessing these services. We also find that there is variation in the ease with which citizens are able to access services. Finally, we note the varying degrees of citizen trust in both elected as well as unelected political institutions. And more generally, we find that farther away an institution from a citizen, the more trust this institution elicits. In addition, we find the reliance on local government institutions appears to have grown tremendously since the early 90s and since the second and third amendments, as has the importance of panchayat and ward level elected officials in delivering public services to citizens. Now, this is kind of a broad summary, and we are happy to talk more about it later on. But let me move on and finally talk about some of the key conclusions and directions for the future that we can look at. First, this study, this volume is primarily descriptive in nature. We describe patterns in public opinion across key identities and categories such as caste and class identities, religious identities, gender, levels of education, and location, whether a citizen lives in rural or in urban India. However, the data, the large size, allows for more in-depth analyses and provides, as we had noted earlier, an opportunity to test theories about Indian politics and society. Indeed, a recent special issue of Studies in Indian Politics released last year contains articles that use this data in order to test broader hypotheses about public opinion in India. Secondly, scholars have suggested that India is witnessing a structural shift in politics, a shift that is said to have begun in 2014, a shifting ideological middle ground toward ethno-political majoritarianism. This study, therefore, can be seen as a baseline study of social and political attitudes conducted in a new era of Indian politics. Further surveys, we hope, can trace out a temporal pattern in the fluidity or the rigidity in and in the durability of public opinion over time. Finally, in continuation with the previous point, we draw attention to the sorts of public opinion that might be more durable and form the basis for politics and society in the coming decades. Public opinion, we find, are unified on some issues and are extremely polarized on other issues. We therefore forecast a mixed future for democracy in India. On one hand, we observe public opinion that takes an illiberal hue, where majoritarianism dominates, minorities are threatened, and freedom of expression is curtailed. On the other hand, high public trust in institutions that guard against institutional breaches indicates the burden such institutions will have to carry in sustaining democracy. While this might be sufficient to sustain democracy, significant democratic deepening seems uncertain at this point. We think, and in conclusion, we think that this is a very sobering, if not an alarming finding. I will stop at that stage and Hilal, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth, for summing up this extensive data and making a very intelligent point, and provoking all of us to read the book by ourselves in order to find out more about the book, about the arguments which can be made on the basis of this baseline study. Uh, Now I think that things are in order because of that chaos we had initially. I apologize for the technical fault which we had initially. Before I invite both the panelists to make comment on the book, I think it would be nice if we formally release the book now, and then we go ahead with the discussion on the book. So let me take this opportunity to invite all of you to release the book formally, uh, at least on your screen.
Where is Suhas Palshikar? Is not seen. Okay.
We can have another photograph when he comes back.
हाँ, फोटोशॉप कर देंगे बाद में.
Oh, gosh.
Hilal,
Okay.
it's over. The book is
Okay. I think we have done it. So it's in a self-congratulatory mode. We congratulate each other. So the book is now released formally. Now I invite Professor Jodhka to make his remarks on the book. Over to you, Professor Jodhka.
Thank you very much, Hilal. Thank you very much, Sanjay, CSD, for asking me to be part of this very interesting discussion. And I must begin by congratulating the two authors as well as CSDS for initiating. CSDS has been doing wonderful work over the past many years, and I think this opens up a new line of surveys and studies, which I think CSDS perhaps is the only organization that could have taken it up. And it's extremely innovative idea. I think it's something which at some level many of us have been waiting for, something like this. And it is something that, like election surveys, and I think as Siddharth was pointing out, needs to be regularized, institutionalized, that we have it every 2 years or 5 years or 3 years or whatever periodicity. And these kinds of surveys, which kind of look at normal periods, quote unquote, are quite routinely done in many other countries. Panel surveys, people go back to either same individuals or similar kind of respondents, and then they build up data. And then, in some sense, it becomes a resource for quantitatively understanding what is happening in society. I think surveys play a very, very important role, and I completely agree with Siddharth how
the data idea of surveys has not really, in some sense, taken very seriously by disciplines like sociology, social anthropology, and even political science. And we keep talking about, because we have background in social anthropology, and that kind of makes qualitative research easier. And therefore, everybody goes to a village or to a community or to a particular area where you kind of stay and interview people and speak qualitatively, which is very good. But at the same time, surveys have their own place. And why CSDS? Because I think CSDS has been pioneering in this field, and also I think this interface of society and politics is also very, very critical for a country like India, where in some sense uh, uh, democracy, or the introduction of democracy, has been a very, very important, what one should say, interventionist strategy. And this interventionist strategy uh, was visualized right in the beginning. I think democracy was not simply just a matter of conducting elections. If we look at Ambedkar and Nehru and other people who initiated the process of democracy in India, they were very clear in their mind that along with development, democratic political process is going to transform India. It's going to make it possible for Indians to think beyond their local communities, caste hierarchies, and other kinds of limitations that a country like India, many people thought that democracy will not survive in India. So yes, I mean, democracy is difficult to flourish in a country like India, and we are seeing that happening in front of our eyes, which also comes out in study, as Siddharth rightly said. But at the same time, it is also the other way around possible, that once you introduce electoral process, that also has societal implications and transforms relations. And this is precisely what I think a long time back, Rudolphs and later on Rajni Kothari had actually theorized in a very systematic way about caste, that when caste enters politics, it is not only that there is casteization of democratic politics, but there is also politicization and to some extent also democratization of caste. When caste groups have to elect their presidents and form associations, they don't remain hierarchical groupings; they become something else, and that in some sense has also been a subject of discussions and debates. So I think thinking like this, that there are elections and there are moments when there are no elections, though framing itself is coming from people who do election studies, because it also tends to suggest that elections are a normal state, and not having election is kind of an anomaly which you ought to study. So this itself, in a sense, is a very interesting way of framing the question. And I would try to frame it the other way around: that normal times there are no elections, but elections happen periodically. And the book also says that elections happen periodically. What do elections do to these opinions? These would be the normal state. And I think looking at this relationship would also be a very interesting idea. And you have both sets of surveys. And if you were to kind of counterpose the findings of this study with the finding of election studies, do you see any difference? And I think that itself would be an interesting kind of research paper that you could perhaps pursue with this data, and that perhaps would be very, very useful, that how during elections these new relationships get formed. And if one was to go to elections of 1960s, we don't have data, unfortunately, the kind of data that we are able to collect, and that's why I think the idea about baseline is very, very critical. But if you were to compare what has made these friendships possible, what has made these kinds of institutional deliveries possible, or what has made these aspirations possible. And I think that kind of comparative reading of data would itself become very, very useful. And in some sense, this study, even though you don't attempt it in this, but this makes that possible. And I think to think of elections as an interventionist moment, and normal period is the time when you don't have elections. And that I think is also something that you are suggesting. So I think that is one of the main comments that I wanted to make. And second point that I also wanted to make in relation to this, that one should also perhaps simultaneously think qualitatively, right? Think of politics which is not electoral, right? And what happens to politics which is not electoral? And there, the reference point is obviously straight away what we have seen just recently. Farmers have been protesting, and movements have been going on. So I'm talking about political process which is not electoral, right? And how does that political process engage with state, and how does it impact state processes? It's not simply a question of people. So it's not simply a question of unions asking for some benefits, but it is also consequential. Is this sound coming only on my mic? Yeah. So I think one should also perhaps visualize politics and other politics, or other times a little more politically, perhaps that non-electoral moments of politics are also very important moments of politics. And how does one qualitatively then, in some sense, incorporate those processes into thinking of electoral politics, or thinking of Indian society? What makes opinion? I think one thing, I've been following the farmers' movement over the past 1 year very closely, and they've been repeatedly talking about new solidarities across Punjab as Bada Bhai and Haryana as Chota Bhai, Punjab and UP, Takat wearing turban and going to Punjab, and new kind of, in some sense, articulation of caste identities, Jat identities, how Sikhism invented itself. But most importantly, also questions of gender, men and women sitting together, making langar. And these are profoundly transformative moments. And these are also moments of political socialization, right? And I think this is something that we have seen right now. Everything is happening online, so you can access it more easily. But I've also been kind of following it up because it's also area of my interest. But all social movements, I think, are moments which are transformative moments of different kinds. There are moments where political socialization becomes, in some sense, possible, and it happens in very different ways. And this is how, in some sense, democracy, in some sense, becomes deeper and deeper in Indian society. So one should also look at those kinds of processes when political scientists talk about deepening of politics. Elections are certainly, obviously, very, very critical. And in that sense, a related point is also, for example, when the Prime Minister announced a repeal of farm laws, Ravish came up with a program, and he said, if there were no elections, what would have happened to farmers' movement? So almost everyone thinks that these farm laws have been repealed because of UP elections. Takat has been saying again and again that if there were electoral politics, and if these politicians were interested in elections, the movement would have not gone on for so long. So I think this is a very important kind of what one should say point that comes out of this movement, where moment of electoral politics also becomes a moment of negotiation. And this moment of negotiation then also becomes a moment of, at some level, bargaining and accommodation and kind of expansion of democratic sensibilities. There's just one or two more points I would want to kind of say, and then I'll kind of wind up. One which is kind of slightly critical point, but also I think something that as sociologist I could bring up, and that is the social life of administrative categories, or the kind of categories that we use in any survey. They have their advantages, and they also have their limitations. And I think in this context, there are a couple of categories that I think we need to keep revisiting. One is, for example, when we are looking at friendships across communities. Friendship across communities are then framed in terms of official categories, or categories that we use at pan-Indian level, and then we look at a regional picture, and then we try to compare them. For example, if you ask somebody in Haryana and Punjab, do you have a close friend among scheduled tribes? Now, Punjab and Haryana, neither of them have an ST list, right? People in Haryana perhaps would have, many of them in rural areas would have only heard about ST as slash category in relation to SC, but otherwise STs are not there in Haryana. Not that there are no communities which could broadly be classified as STs, but this list does not exist. I think Delhi also doesn't have an ST list. So what happens to kind of framing of questions, and I would have preferred that not applicable would have been a better response for responses from Haryana and Punjab, rather than comparing Punjab and Haryana with Chhattisgarh and Odisha, that here you have interaction between tribals and general population much more than you have in Haryana. So I think this kind of nuancing would perhaps be useful, because these are official categories. These are not categories that people work with or live with. But even the categories that people live with, I think, for example, Dalit and SC is itself a very kind of contested category. And I think we need to perhaps, all of you do surveys. And I would like to flag this point, that I remember in one of the discussions of one paper I wrote, and then it was translated by Punjabi Tribune, and it was published in Punjabi. I got phone calls from many people in Punjab, and they say, "Why do you use the word Dalit for us?" Right? So we are not Dalits. I mean, Dalit is an abusive word, and you should never use it again in your articles about us. So I was a little taken aback, and then I tried to argue with him that this is a kind of general category. No. We are very clear. We are not Dalits. So I asked them, so what would you like yourself to be described as? He says, we are scheduled castes, right? You call us scheduled castes, but scheduled caste is also an administrative category. It has its limitations. If you're talking about Christian Dalits, they may not be scheduled caste, but still be Dalits. But they would not accept those arguments. But also, I think there is another point which I have been trying to articulate, that we very, in some sense, unproblematically have become used to using these words low caste and upper caste. I find it problematic. I find it, unless one puts it in double quotes, this is also a judgmental category. And somebody who belongs to a low caste, when sees that his community is listed as low, I'm not saying that it is only morally kind of, not acceptable or ethically not acceptable, but caste groups, all of us who have done empirical work among caste communities, every community is proud of themselves, right? If you ask a Valmiki, anytime a Valmiki woman marries outside, or a Valmiki man who has become an IAS officer marries a non-Valmiki woman, the community feels really angry, right? So they don't see themselves as in any way low. They say that, yeah, for social purposes, we might have been cheated, and this is how we are described, but we are very proud of ourselves, and they very proudly also describe themselves. And I think this is something that, as social scientists, we need to talk about, and it has so far not been talked about. And we need to find language which is both politically acceptable and also takes into account kind of regional differences. Can we use ex-untouchables? Can we use scheduled caste? Would that be better? This be better? I think that's a matter which needs to be discussed. But I think this is a point which we must flag at this moment, when caste question, in some senses, is turning itself into something else. And in that context, most of the articulation of caste today comes from those margins, and I think we need to kind of consult them on how should one in some sense talk about communities, right? OBC also, for example, is a region specific category. In Bihar, there would also be EBCs. EBCs and OBCs would become very interesting kind of differences. Similarly, Dalit and Mahadalits have also become administrative categories, not only political categories. So I think this would be an interesting moment or an interesting point of discussion for making surveys more acceptable and less kind of, anybody who is responding to it, they should not think that we are prejudged. And that's something all of us who do empirical work, we know these are critical things. I think my last couple of points, just another 2 minutes and I'll wind up. And I think what I really found very, very interesting in this study is that it kind of breaks stereotypes, right? For example, on question of gender, women having friends outside their gender, this is something which is unthinkable. And rural India's, at least 5%, 10%, 20%. 20% is a large number. If you're 15 to 20% women are saying that we have a male friend outside our caste community, or we have a male friend living in the village, that's a revolution, right? And I think we need to take these findings more seriously, and I think we need to also push them further conceptually, that India is a fluid society, whether it is question of caste or question of gender or question of community, interreligious relationships. And I think there is a kind of a particular static way in which partly politicians and partly also people like us, but most importantly journalists, have kind of frozen these categories. And normally we think that, if you are this, then you can never interact with that, and those kinds of things. And this survey in some sense kind of shows us empirically that this is not really the case. And then obviously the regional variations, and looking at Kerala and coming at top in many of these things, followed by Punjab, but then other regions. And these kinds of regional stories are very interesting kind of things. And my final point is that I've been saying it earlier also when we were occasionally invited to ICSSR. Now we are not, but there is this need for a regular opinion survey. We know our data sets evolved out of planning for development kind of endeavor, and they were all designed by economists. So there are some social variables in census and NSSO and other kind of surveys. Right now we have this family health survey. But I think just thinking of society and politics, and then having a survey every 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, the point that you were also referring to and I mentioned earlier as well, and treat this as baseline, which is not really defining society in terms of between elections or during elections. But it could be a periodic parallel survey, which is mostly done at a time when there are no elections. There are elections all the time happening in India. That's another matter. But I think one should kind of think of those kind of surveys independently of elections, which are social surveys. For example, we don't have any data on intercaste marriages. People have some kind of guesses and some odd small level surveys, but we actually don't have a pan-Indian across community comparable data on how many people marry outside their caste group and outside their religious community, outside their, you can 3 or 4 variables. This itself would give us such rich data. And then we go on talking about, the Indian societies, this or that. And that's where I think we need empirical data on a country like India, a society like India, which is so vast, so diverse, so complex, and so fluid. And I think this is a very, very valuable exercise. I congratulate you again, and I thank you again for inviting me to this discussion and asking me to read this book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I read nearly 2/3 of it, but I'll kind of go through it again and kind of make sense of the data much more. And I think there's a lot to interpret, as Siddharth in the beginning said rightly.
Yeah, I'm back. Thank you very much, Professor Jodhka, for making these remarks. Before further delay, I would like to invite Professor Sudha Pai to make her remarks.
Thank you, Hilal. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak on this very interesting book. I must admit, I haven't been able to read all of it. It's also a book that needs to be read very carefully because there are, many things which need to be understood and to be considered very, very carefully. Um, we are all familiar with the literature on elections in India. CSDS has done so many of these surveys, election studies which tell us about voting behavior along caste, class, urban, rural, age lines, etc. But I think this is, I must congratulate CSDS, Azim, Premji, and all those involved in this and the authors, that they have looked at what happens between elections and how public opinion is shaped by what they call social attitudes, intercommunity relationships, governance patterns, public order, etc. And I would say that broadly, I think this book is important for, at least for me, for 2 major reasons. One is, I think, uh, given the kind of times we are in, or at any time for that matter, it draws attention to the very complex country that we are. How necessary it is to do public opinion surveys in India's states and not just do it at the national level, but to go down into the states. Because India is a very diverse and a very, very complex society. And I think this book brings it out very well. Because you see, nowadays we see so many books on elections which just tell you who voted for whom and what happened in each state election and so on. But the complexity of each state, its politics, why the elections are what they are like, and what underlies them in terms of public opinion. I think this book is a beginning in that direction. And in that sense, it breaks new ground, it makes you think. The second very important thing which I found was that I think, in a way, this will require more analysis maybe. Right now, you have put all the data together, that it draws attention to the very swift changes that we have been experiencing. And yet, those swift changes are very complex. They are a mix of the past, the present, and the future in a way. It's like, a very, very fast kind of movement in which you have to capture the rapidity of that movement. And that movement is different again in different parts of the country. So I think because most literature again just talks about majoritarianism, authoritarianism, and so on. But I think this swift changes underlying it. For example, as I told somebody, I think the right wing hegemony and Modi is a societal phenomenon. It's not, just that, these people have come here and they have won an election and, they have shown their strength and it's a well-oiled election machine. But it is a societal phenomenon. And to that extent, public opinion, understanding public opinion, doing surveys on that is extremely important. So I think in these two ways, this book is, a beginning in a new direction and is therefore very important and is and brings together extremely valuable data. Um, I think what is argued here is that periods between elections are the time when public opinion takes shape, often becoming enduring, often changing over time, forming the political culture of a nation, and then affecting election outcomes. So, public opinion is doing a number of things. It's undergoing change. It's being formed and reformed, reinvented all the time, especially because of rapid change. And then, in turn, it is affecting elections as such. And I think the book does make the book makes a distinction between electoral and non-electoral behavior between citizens and voters, which is useful. But I'll come back to this point later. Um, the surveys, of course, across about 23 states, and we have a wide cross-section of views and social attitudes. What I'm going to do is, because most of our audience has not read the book, I thought I would divide my comments into two parts. And that is, first, I would like to talk about the content of the book a little bit. What is it? What are the various variables that we use? And how, there are regional differences, how caste, community, region, urban, rural, etc., cuts through this and makes public opinion different everywhere, and so give a certain flavor of the book. Then I will come to some of my observations, what are the major takeaways of the book, and some observations I would like to make about the book as a whole. I've just sort of picked and I've really read the part called Social Universe more carefully. I've not really read the political institutions that carefully, probably because I found Social Universe more fascinating and closer to what I usually kind of read about. Now let's look at friendship between communities. 50% of respondents said that they have a close Dalit friend, but upper caste respondents said that were the ones which were the most likely, unlikely, or the least likely to have a Dalit friend. So we find that there is a certain relationship between Dalits and the upper caste as such. But we do find variations in terms of education, location in a particular state, or whether you are in urban or in rural. And we find that education and urban living promotes friendship across castes, which means that interrelationship between castes is also undergoing a change parallel to the process of urbanization and if you have education. Although education can work in many ways, as this book also shows. Of course, but almost the reverse is the case of Muslims who have very few friends or practically no friends across, outside their religion, especially in the northern states. But again, education and urban living, even here, make a difference. We find that this is only in the northern states. Christians, for example, 60% said they had no friends among non-Christians. But where there's a large Christian population, the northeast or the Kerala, or in Kerala, they are likely to have a Hindu friend. So, where you are located, the kind of society in which you are located and which has its own historical trajectory over a period of time and level of education, its economy, and so on, seems to make a difference. Over 50% of respondents prefer to approach a leader of the same caste and religion, particularly in rural areas. So this at least has not changed. I remember James Mena writing about, what he called political fixers. People who were more or less from the same caste, and they approached them, and there were these people who did this fixing. But in a few states, such as Kerala, Delhi, Andhra Pradesh, Punjab, religion and caste doesn't seem to matter. People will approach anybody they think who is influential enough and who will be able to help them. Respondents from wealthier backgrounds are less likely to prefer approaching a leader from the same religion compared to the poorer ones. But I think the most interesting are perceptions about social communities. How do we look at each other? What are our perceptions about other people, about caste and religious communities other than one's own? 20% said, less than 20% said that Dalits are lazy. But in some states, UP, Bihar, and Tamil Nadu, the percentage is much, much higher. Upper caste were the least likely, of course, to see Dalits and Adivasis as hardworking. And interestingly, as educational attainments increase and you go to college, more see them as lazy, which shows that there are elite and class attitudes also involved here, and that just because you get educated and you are better off and you have a better income, you don't necessarily change your ideas where caste is concerned. So, what is it that changes caste attitudes would be then an interesting question, because education apparently doesn't seem to. When we come to patriotism, Muslims are unpatriotic, but this, of course, changes where there are large Muslim populations where they are seen as highly patriotic. And then there are some states where, of course, in northern states, where they are seen as extremely unpatriotic, and then there is cluster in the middle. So I think the book very interestingly divides into categories where all these castes and communities are concerned. Hindus, interestingly, view themselves as extremely peaceful. I suppose as a majority community, they have a right to do it, but that's the view they hold about themselves. And they hold the same about Christians, but they see Muslims um, as extremely violent. Um, when you have freedom of expression, three questions were asked here: preference for dictatorship over democracy, criticism of elected leaders, and making fun of a community other than one's own, and violence against another community. Now, India has had many, many kinds of movements, Dalit movement, women's movement, backward caste movement, post-independence India. So I think this question needs to be seen against the movements which have taken place, and how much of a dent have they made? What kind of an impact have they had? Now we find, interestingly, over 50% feel that freedom to criticize leaders across states and make remarks that make fun of other communities is fine. But it's not good to make fun of other communities. And very few agree that violence against others is correct. Of course, minorities agree much more, Sikhs, Muslims, and Christians as such. Here, education doesn't seem to make a difference. Um, Very interesting are the differences in national and regional identity. There seem to be three categories here. One is a category called equal identity. Both national and regional seem in the perspectives of people to hold more or less an equal place. And it's interesting, maybe if this survey is done after a few years, you'll find the states will change. Now here, equal identity is Karnataka, Kerala, Punjab, Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, and Andhra Pradesh. Second category, where a more national identity is there, is of course the northern states, Bihar, UP, Delhi, Haryana, which obviously have no regional identities historically. But in the same category, we also find Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Jharkhand, and Bengal. So it's interesting that Bengal has a national identity also. I mean, they seem to, it's not that they don't have a regional identity, but they veer towards a greater national identity. Third, where regional identity predominates, which are the peripheral states of India. Obviously, it would happen Tamil Nadu, Mizoram, Nagaland, Orissa, there's Gujarat, there's Jammu and Kashmir, though percentages would vary. Rural respondents feel more regional than urban, and education and exposure to media seems here to make a great difference, because then people are able to understand the nation and understand national identity much better. And so education, helps you to change your perspective and move beyond your own narrow region and community maybe and move on. Similar to that is language. Um, for example, in places like Delhi, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and even Tamil Nadu, people said, you don't have to use local language. Any language is fine, and the use of this statement of any language increases with education. Of course, a strong nationalism has taken root wherever there is a cultural tone or support for it, uh, making it into majoritarian nationalism. This is, of course, there in the Hindi belt, Maharashtra, and also in Maharashtra, Gujarat, Orissa, Karnataka, all states where the BJP seems to be dominant. States with a minority population, large minority population, have a more pluralist view. Jammu Kashmir, Mizoram, Kerala, Bengal, etc. But Hindus across all castes tend to support punishment for not standing while the national anthem is being played. Very interestingly, Hindu Dalits also tend to support a majoritarian position, while Adivasis exhibit the least tendency to it. And this is true where Hindu Dalits are concerned of the national anthem, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, religious conversion, and peace. It's interesting because the BJP has been able to attract a section of the Dalits towards itself. Now, many people ask this question: is this, a kind of cultural move towards Hinduism and becoming part of the larger Hindu identity, or is it merely an electoral tactic? But here we find that Hindu Dalits seem to support, tend to support a majoritarian population. But here there's an index of nationalism. There's liberal nationalism where minorities are high. There's centrist in places like Andhra Pradesh, Bengal, Telangana, Assam, Kerala, and Tripura. And then there's the conservative nationalist northern states where this difference is there. Caste-wise, all Hindu castes, upper caste, OBC, Dalit, Adivasi, non-Dalit Sikhs, all seem to fall into the conservative nationalist slot. But the highest percentage is, of course, the upper caste. Interestingly, as education levels rise, the likelihood of holding a conservative position also rises. Now, I don't know, maybe somebody would contest this, that when you get educated, why should you be like that? But I think we have found in our own experiences that people we know who are highly educated, who belong to our own middle class or upper middle class families, they also tend to hold these conservative opinions. I'll be quick in this. I think earlier Siddharth made some points on populism. Um, this section on populism is interesting because it does capture a certain reality today, a distinction between the people and the others. There seems to be a section of people who believe that their interests and needs are not being met by others. Who is blocking your interests? Elites, upper caste, migrants, outsiders, minorities. Thankfully, they didn't say people in JNU. Uh, but this is different in different states. Anti-elitism seems to be very high in Delhi, UP, Kashmir, Punjab. Kerala is the opposite. And younger people seem to be more swayed by populist rhetoric. Dalits, obviously, within the Hindu population, have a high percentage of those who share this anti-elite attitude, probably because of their relationship to the upper caste. Education helps those who have, particularly those who have a college education, to be less to hold a less anti-elite attitude as such. But interestingly, when people were asked whether politics is a battle or a compromise between good and evil, only 29% said it's a battle, despite holding an anti-elite feeling. And the rest said that it can be it's a compromise. and that compromise actually lies at the heart of contestation. So I think there's a lot of hope for us. People don't seem to see it as a battle, end all and for all, and so on. I think I will now move on to some what I thought were the major takeaways, which are there, some of which are obvious, but some of which I think we need to look at more closely. As was already said, social bridging is weak and society is segmentary. That is, relationships across castes are far more conservative. And here I was reminded of what Satish Sabharwal wrote in one of his writings, that Indian society is one which has various segments. There is one which is cellular, and that is having each segment having a life of its own. And yet, it's not a watertight compartment, it still remains fluid. How fluid it is, I think changes are taking place, and those changes are taking place in different places as such. And this, of course, has implications for inclusion, exclusion in civil society and in any kind of institution that we have. And as has already been said, these views unfortunately create the kind of stereotypes we hold about other people. So the social universe is a mix of traditional and modern values, inclusion, exclusion, and so on. For example, there is formal support for greater agency for women, but at the same time, there's an expectation that a woman's place is at home. So there is a certain, as the authors say, a certain ambivalence about where these ideas are taking us in the future. We seem to be moving back and forward. It's like, when a tradition modernizes, it carries certain baggage forward, it doesn't carry the rest. So this is a change that, if I think you go deeper into the data, you will be able to show even better as such. Citizens are in agreement and in disagreement on certain issues. That is, there's great polarization on certain issues. There's also trust in some government institutions, and there's very high distrust in others. So these are things that are indication of how public institutions, etc., are functioning. About the future, I think the results are shown as mixed. That, as has already been said, that authoritarian turn is not in the immediate offing. And but while this may sustain democracy, as the authors say, it will not lead to deepening of democracy. So that's a very sobering thought. Now let me make some observations finally on the book. One is that the percentage of what is called no opinion is quite high in some cases. As much as in some cases, I may be wrong, I read the book fast, about 40%. Gujarat seems to be one state where no opinion is very high. I don't know if I'm wrong, please correct me. And this is on many questions, including nationalism. So I think that is something to be kept in mind and be careful. The second thing I would say is that this distinction between electoral and non-electoral behavior and between citizens and voters. Now, if such a survey was held in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, this distinction would be much more clear. Because of the kind of politics that was there. Today, what is happening is you have a very divisive election campaign which shapes public opinion during the campaign. This is carried over, and then the party wins. Suppose the BJP wins, they then promote Hindutva. Their foot soldiers like the Bajrang Dal promote polarization, and everything seems to continue at a local level, even in the campaign mode. So, sorry, how clear is this distinction? I mean, one thing seems to carry over into the other as such. So, I would say that such surveys actually help in understanding electoral politics and behavior. Public opinion is getting shaped, and we seem to become a society, have become a polity where there are constant elections. It's one state election after the other, and political parties, particularly the ruling party, seems to be in a campaign mode altogether. So this distinction, I think you'll have to fine tune it even more. There seems to be a very symbiotic relationship between elections and politics. Between elections, each affects the other. They are not separate as such. Though I don't think you have said that at all. The Bengal election here is an exception. Huge campaign, and yet, there is an underlying public opinion which is already there, which then decides this is not what we want. And we don't like all this, and so we are not going to vote for the BJP. So, is Bengal an outlier, or um, is it that the impact of populism is waning a little bit, and a little bit, it's such are not going to be these kinds of political communal campaigns last minute by Modi and others are not going to be that effective. That way, the UP election, which I'm also waiting for, is going to be a very big test. uh, you know, has what happened in these 5 long years going to be reflected in the election? What is the cap that people will wear when they vote? So I think Bengal was is something that needs to be studied and looked at in great detail. Also, I will say that such surveys need to be done frequently at different points of time as change has been very, very rapid. The statewide differences I've already mentioned are the most interesting part of the book, and clearly, the Hindi heartland is more influenced by the election mode, you know, rather than other states which seem to have a more stable public opinion. I don't know whether it's in the case of UP, for example, it's political backwardness, economic underdevelopment, social conservatism. So, are there geographical limits to the impact of Hindutva as we move from the north to the south? I hope I haven't taken too much time, but I'm just finishing. Dalits interestingly seem to share opinions regarding populism and elitism with other Hindu castes. But this is stronger in UP than in Bengal. Bengal, has the highest percentage of Dalits in this country. So regional differences and rapidity of change in these matter. So I was reminded of what Ainsley Embry said, who pointed out how the Brahminical Hindu culture is more marked in the heartland than in the peripheral regions, where other kinds of things, regional identities become more important. There's also Ganesh Kudesha's work on the building of the heartland, that is UP. Um, so such surveys are also important and should be done frequently because they show how social change has been different in different parts of the subcontinent. The nature and the rapidity of change in different regions has been different. So I think I'll stop there. And many congratulations for a book which I enjoyed reading and which I think I should read a little more carefully as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pai, for these extensive remarks. Now we have some time for question answer session. So I would invite those who are watching this program. If you have any specific question to any of the panelists, please send that to us through chat box.
Hilal, Suhasji would now give a vote of thanks.
Yeah, that is because there was a very poor network in my room, so I have now coming to another room where the things are in order, I suppose. Yeah, so before I invite Suhas Bhai, I think we can have a few questions, and we will have some discussion, and then finally the final remark and vote of thanks would be delivered by Suhas Bhai. So I again invite those who are actually watching this program. If you have any question, please send that question to us in the chat box, the comment section.
Hilal, I would just like to make a comment about the reports themselves that were written after every stage of the survey. As Sanjay ji pointed out, first it was 4 states, followed by 8 states, followed by 12 states. These reports are actually archived on an Azim Premji University website. If there is any place I could write it out, I could do that. I'm unable to do so in the comments section, but perhaps if it could be put up by someone, I can write it out in a comment box and then maybe someone from behind
That would be very
kind of.
useful. I would love to look at those more in detail.
Yeah. Siddharth, if you want to elaborate that, if you have anything else to say on this.
Sorry, I've just
If
I
you, yeah. Okay. So if that is the case, then I think the report, yes. Sanjay Ludaji has just asked this question. Can we have the reports on Lokniti website too?
yes, yes.
Yes, we can. Yeah. So I think this is now 5:20. So it would be great if I invite Suhas Pai to make a few comments and vote of thank. Over to you, Suhas Pai.
So as unmute, you are mute.
Thank you, Hilal bhai. Uh, I don't intend to make any comments as such uh, because this is not the occasion for me at the end of the session to make any comments, but to propose a vote of thanks. I would just try to repeat what has already been said in terms of the importance of these findings, in spite of the various nuances that are required and the limitations that commentators, panelists, and others may point out, which is that both Professor Sudha Pai and Professor Surinder Jodhka pointed out that there must be a regular or more frequent study of this kind because, in a sense, even in ordinary circumstances, a society requires such monitoring of the type of political culture it cultivates and sustains. In the Indian case in particular, we are probably entering into an arena where there is a paradigmatic shift in which we look at politics, we look at society, we look at ourselves, think of ourselves, and therefore, frequent studies of this kind would be far too important. We hope that we are lucky enough and fortunate enough to have support of foundations like the Azim Premji Foundation in the case of this study to continue such studies in the future also. And therefore, I think I must begin by proposing a vote of thanks to the Azim Premji Foundation, which made it possible for us to come together and do this study for 3 years. Before I turn to the rest of the vote of thanks, I must also underscore the importance of this study in terms of a collaborative nature in which this study was undertaken. In a sense, those who are accustomed to the way Lokniti functions know that there has been a long-term collaboration that Lokniti colleagues do internally. But this is also an occasion where we had a collaboration with Azim Premji University and many colleagues from the Azim Premji University. And one hopes that this tradition of collaborative social scientific research of an empirical nature continues, and this study would have done a lot, if not academically, at least in terms of this suggestion that collaborative studies by social scientists in India are possible and they can be fruitful. Now, to turn to the vote of thanks, our first vote of thanks will go to our colleagues and panelists who made it possible to spare time. I know that Surinder had another engagement, but both Professor Surinder Jodhka and Professor Sudha Pai readily agreed to speak on this occasion. Not only speak, but also go through the report and make very insightful comments. So we are indeed grateful to both of them. Apart from Professor Jodhka and Professor Sudha Pai, I must mention a few persons, two of our younger colleagues who literally piloted the study for 3 years. I hope they are both in the audience, Asha and Jyoti. Asha was then with the Azim Premji University and Jyoti is with Lokniti even now. Both of them, from both these institutional ends, in a way ensured smooth sailing not only of the surveys but also of the writing of the report, the coordination of data analysis, and practically everything related to the three reports that we have put out earlier. Our thanks also go to the various state coordinators of the Lokniti in the 24 places, in the 24 states where the study was conducted, because without their help, without their collaboration, without their cooperation, this fieldwork couldn't have been completed. In the intellectual conception of this study, we were fortunate to have also collaboration and deep engagement from two colleagues, one Ashutosh Varshney and another Sudhir Krishnaswamy. Ashutosh was at that time a visiting faculty with the APU, and Sudhir was also on the faculty of the APU. So we were fortunate to have their deep engagement in the conceptualization and operationalization of this study. CSDS, as usual, has been home to this important field-based study for a long period of 3 years, and therefore all colleagues at Lokniti and CSDS must also be not only congratulated but sincerely thanked on this occasion. The other colleague whom we must mention on this occasion is Professor Sandeep Shastri, who was then at Bengaluru and is currently Vice Chancellor of the Jagran Lake University at Bhopal, who was one of the anchors, advisors, and active collaborator in this conspiracy to map out the political culture of contemporary India. Not the least, the IT team at the APU and particularly Shashwat must be thanked for this excellent coordination, which initially we thought would be somewhat very cumbersome. So thank you all. And of course, on these times of online occasions, one has to thank the invisible, which is our audience. We trust that the audience would have enjoyed these comments and the audience would continue to enjoy, because this would be on YouTube and they would take away many of the points made by the commentators, and one would enjoy also the report that has now been released. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Suhas Pai. So thank you very much all for joining us. So on behalf of CSDS, Lokniti and APU, I thank you all, and we finish the program. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.